So, welcome back to episode 6 of this third series of the PloughCast, focused on our current issue, Beyond Borders. I'm Susannah Black, senior editor at Plough.
And I'm Peter Momsen, editor-in-chief of Plough Quarterly Magazine.
And we are here with listener questions and also some kind of general reflections on what we've may have or may not have learned. A reminder, if you've not subscribed, do that now. We're going to be going after this episode into 6 weeks worth of basically Plough read-alouds, which are also great to listen to. And then we will be back with, season 4 of our podcast for the next issue.
Well, we have some really great listener questions today. Are open borders required for Christians to support? Is Plough socialist? What are some of the other juicy things that we came in?
These are some really good ones. Let's start here. Both of you have said that you have some reservations about the idea of Christendom. Pete, what are your reservations about the idea of Christendom?
Violence. So that the problem with historic Christendom was, of course, that it implied a unity of church and state. So I'm a member of the Bruderhof, or I'm an Anabaptist. I believe that following Jesus involves a commitment to absolute nonviolence in the same way that he lived out, that he taught. That love of enemy is incompatible with the use of lethal force against anyone for any reason for people who are following him. So there's a big problem there with any confessional state arresting or torturing or executing anyone for believing the wrong things. And that's my major reservation with what some people mean by Christendom. But if your idea of Christendom is rather that there is a Christian civilization, a civilization of love, to use the Pope's beautiful phrase, then that's, to me, the opposite of those bad things I just mentioned. And that's a kind of Christendom I can wholeheartedly support.
Mine is a little bit different. So my dad's Jewish ethnically, and I am always very aware of all right, so what would this look like? What would my little integralist fantasies look like for my Jewish family if they decide, if they're, I pray for them. They're not Christian. That is, they should not be compelled to be Christian. And now, obviously, this is, there are many ways to talk about this. One of those ways is that in traditional, in Christendom as it was, the Jews were not treated great at all. But they were given a kind of status as it is okay, at least in principle, for there to be non-Christians in a Christian civilization, even in a Christian empire. And actually, often the Jews were treated better under empires than they were under, for example, in England, which was not part of the empire, which was a kingdom. So I guess thinking more concretely, I pray for everyone. I want everyone to come to Christ. I don't want anyone to be compelled by force to come to Christ. And I want there to be room for the Holy Spirit to do whatever he does with everyone in his own time. And I want there also to be a way for us to live as part of a polity with each other, even if we don't share religious commitments, because we do share, we share our humanity, and we share our understanding of the natural law, or at least our awareness of the natural law, of what is, of basic ideas about what humans are and what goodness is. Even if we don't agree on those intellectually, I think we experience them directly. And I think there's a way for us to love each other politically, even if we don't share faith commitments, in the way that a family can love each other, even if they don't share faith commitments. And I want there to be room for political love among people who are among Christians and non-Christians. And so that's my primary reservation with the idea of Christendom. But actually, the idea of Christendom in principle can include that. So that's kind of what I would say.
And I think that just needs to be done with a great care for liberty of conscience, which sounds and some people will say that's a very post-Enlightenment liberal thing to talk about, but it is not. Early church father Tertullian speaks eloquently about there not being compulsion in matters of religion. And of course, that was when the early Christians were on the receiving end of compulsion in the matters of religion. But the principle holds true too, the other way around. And it just holds true pastorally. I mean, I think in terms of my own community, the Bruderhof, where we are, you could say a little Christendom inside our community living together. There is an expectation that not everyone will necessarily be Christian, but we do expect that you will be open to seeking God's will with us. That's actually the language we use, and that's sort of the condition for an adult, at least, to stay a longer time in our community. But that goes together with a deep respect for the integrity of the individual conscience, which, again, is not just some post-Enlightenment invention, but goes back to the heart of Christendom, that God wants willing followers, right? God wants people who desire to follow him. And, there is also just pretty concrete historical examples. I mean, you can mention, of course, most extremely, the 3,000 Anabaptists being, drowned and burned at the stake and so forth in the 15th century. And everyone says, oh, well, that's an old story. But actually, it's kind of not that old. Yeah. And there's a softer version of it. There's the little Mennonite family I know in Colombia. The country of Colombia had Catholicism as the official religion in the Constitution till, not quite a generation ago. And they actually had to flee their native village because their kids were so bullied in school for not going to the state-mandated Catholic religious education classes. So, in what sense is the gospel served by any type of regime like that? I think, it comes back to the question, what is truly a Christian society? And I would argue that's actually not a Christian society. That's one going under the name of Christian that's actually oppressive. And so a truly Christian Christendom.
A truly Christian Christendom, I think I would go for.
What's next?
A friend of the magazine and of the community wrote that you state that those who advocate using lethal force to keep out migrants are denying the faith. That was a quote from your lead editorial. So he wants to know, is that anyone who supports any kind of border enforcement, from Biden to Trump, from Ocasio-Cortez to Cruz, all of these politicians support some kind of border enforcement. Is that what you meant, basically? Like, come on, Pete.
Right. So basically any Christian, and this was, essentially the point that this writer was making to me, was that if you say that anybody who supports any type of border enforcement, which involves at least a threat of lethal force, is denying the faith, is possibly not even a Christian, right? Is an apostate, I suppose, if you want to really push the line of argument. That would apply to a heck of a lot of people, including probably some of you, our dear listeners. No, that's not what I was intending. And in the context of the essay, I make it pretty clear that I was referring to some pretty literally lethal things. So, for instance, I have friends who work with migrants in the Balkans. Some of them are, or very likely are, real refugees, right? They're, at risk of their lives if they return to their home countries in Afghanistan or the Middle East. And there, if you have a hard border with barbed wire and armed guards, and it's the winter, and you have little kids involved, you very quickly reach the point where you literally have people dying to enforce a hard border. And what I was describing in the editorial was very specifically the situation of people using the language of preserving our Christian heritage as a justification for little kids dying in the cold by a barbed wire fence. And that, to me, is denying the faith. That is using the language of Christianity to do deeply anti-Christian things. Yeah. Now, I do think, in the context of a very short editorial, I obviously didn't give a complete, set of criteria for how to judge what a moral migration policy is. And I'm not even going to do that right now, surprisingly enough.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say, well, it's a Mott and Bailey thing, and you've just defended the very strong and, it's very sensible Mott. But then there's this Bailey that we're just going to have no border enforcement at all or no border policy. And my whole thing with Mott and Bailey arguments is you know what? I like Motts. And I like very well-defined, precise arguments. And I don't think that means, I think you just have to be disciplined about not letting yourself then give away the Bailey.
It probably won't surprise longtime listeners to the PloughCast or readers of Plough that we don't view ourselves as a policy journal. Yeah. We are not here to tell those of you who are voting members of Congress what legislation to craft in response to the migration issue. However, there are certain principles that we are passionately committed to, and those do have real-world consequences. And I think there's two that we can name, and one is that welcoming the stranger, caring for the orphan and the widow, are these, as we said in earlier versions of this series, Susannah, are really basic, kind of unconditional, categorical, imperative type things, to use very non-biblical language, that are in the Bible and that you do not get away from by just, waffling about prudence and so forth. We really do need to take seriously that, if you're a believing Christian, Scripture and tradition tell us that God will, as judge, will hold us to account in a particular way for how we treat people in this situation. And we kind of better fear God and take it very seriously. Does that tell you exactly what to do when a lot of Haitian migrants are crossing the Rio Grande? No, but it better inform it pretty well. And the other one is actually something that our good friend, Pater Edmund Waldstein, the Thomist monk from Stift Heiligen Kreuz in Austria, spoke about in the earliest episode of this podcast. I'm not Catholic, but I do largely subscribe to Catholic social teaching, which uses the language of the universal destination of goods. And he uses this cool word, Fringsen, right? Which is German for basically under Catholic social teaching, if you really need something to survive, you're allowed to take it.
Jean Valjean did nothing wrong. I stand.
Exactly. So rather than calling it Fringsen or speaking of the universal destination of goods, which is a lot of syllables, we could just say the Jean Valjean thing is okay. Yeah. And that also applies to migrants trying to get in here.
And there is actually one thing that I kind of wanted to mention, which is that one of the arguments that you especially see people in certain Reformed camps making, and I'm thinking in particular of what is called this is so super inside baseball, but the Westminster West position or R2K, and it's a particular Reformed political theology, which basically wants to say, in a weird way, it's a little bit Niebuhrian, but weird Niebuhrian. It wants to say that the law and the gospel are two utterly different things politically, to the point that it is the job of the church to preach the gospel, and it is the job of the state to enforce the law, and that our commands under the gospel should have essentially no impact on political deliberation or political ethics. And I just don't think that is a very specific position, which is not the majority position. It's not St. Thomas's position in that very, with that very harsh division. What it would mean, just to sort of check yourself if that is starting to sound, good to you, is that it is wrong for a king to be gracious. It is wrong for a king to be merciful. It's wrong for a king to pardon people or to listen to the voice of the poor. That is failing his office as enforcer of pure justice. And that is insane to me, because kings are supposed to imitate God. And just as all people in authority are supposed to mediate God's authority to the world with justice and mercy, and behaving towards the world as Adam failed to do and as we're called to do in Christ. And so that kind of harsh division between law and gospel politically, I think, is a non-starter, but it's also something that I think is behind some people's ideas here.
it may be behind them. It just seems inhuman to divide up one's actions like that. And at the risk of doing 1930s analogies, we can just remember that there have been times in not so distant history when people invoked Romans 13 and this strict separation of the state's authority from the church's ethic, if you want to use that language, in ways that were not so great.
Yeah. And just a sort of one other reminder of what I think is a kind of better model here is what I would call, again, Oscar Romero integralism, where like it is the church's job. It's the job of a pastor to command under, using his authority to speak God's word to those who are his flock, politicians and others, to command them to imitate Christ and to do that politically and to remind those in political authority what it means to actually be just according to God's standards and actually be merciful. Okay, so we also have a question from, if not friend of the pod, then at least close follower of the pod, who shall remain nameless, but who has posted a couple of times when I've posted or when Plough's posted about basically things having to do with refugees and the refugee crisis. How many Afghan refugees has the Bruderhof taken in? And so the implication here is, you want me to take in refugees to my community, i.e. America, but you refuse to do anything concrete and you are maintaining your very well-ordered community. So, Pete, what's the Bruderhof doing about Afghan refugees?
So we've had, to directly answer the questions, we've had 3 to 4 people almost all the time since the Afghan refugee crisis kind of began, working with the organization Save the Children, with whom we have a long partnership, actually welcoming Afghan refugees. A monastic community, so to speak, is obviously not the place where these refugees are being settled, but we do have kind of boots on the ground welcoming refugees, and there is, the best place and way to take care of them when they come is as so often the people who do it well, rather than just people putting up refugees in your basement and wondering what they're meant to do next. So, but we do absolutely take seriously the commitment that when we say things like welcoming refugees is good, it's something that we, especially if we're able to, should do something about.
And I think that one of the things that was implied by that, and by sort of thinking more carefully about these things, is like, this is not something that we do in order to like make ourselves feel good. And therefore, like, it is not necessarily the case that putting up a refugee in your basement is going to be the best thing for that refugee. Like, figuring out where people who are in desperate need can best get on with their lives and can best be integrated into local communities. And like, the point is not to like own the cons. The point is not to like, intentionally disrupt American civilization, whatever, of various kinds. The point is to like actually help people in ways that are effective. And as we mentioned, like, one of the best ways to do that is to do things to prevent there being refugee crises to begin with, which is one of the many reasons why we tend to be pretty down on war. We just don't think it's a great thing. So there's that. That is that. But one thing something that you were talking about did kind of like bring up is the Bruderhof itself does have borders. They're more powerful borders than national borders. You take lifetime vows. You renounce private property. When there's there's nothing fuzzy about who is in the Bruderhof and who's not, including, your own children are not full members. And so, it is not bad to have boundaries. The borders are important. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, of course, the Bruderhof, like any community, has borders, and I can understand why folks would be worried that the national community also needs borders. Otherwise, sort of solidarity among its citizens would be kind of imperiled and diluted. And sort of what's the point of saying we're all Americans who support each other if it's not even clear who's American to start with? Again, you mentioned the parallel to the family, right? The point of a family is not to exclude, and yet a family that included all 7 billion human beings on the planet wouldn't really be a family, right? It needs to make a difference that you're my relative for the purpose of, being part of my family to mean anything. And so I think there is, there's a kind of natural worry there. On the national side, though, I do question to what extent that there really is a national community. I think the United States, with 300 plus million people in it, is a little big to be, hugely worried about cultural cohesion. Like, what is that thing anyway? For the Bruderhof itself, yes, we are a church. And that means, as we were talking in regard to Christendom, it needs to be a place where you want to be, and also where you feel that God has called you and where you submit to the discipline and the order and the expectations of the community.
But, of course, hypothetically, if an Afghan family wanted to join the Bruderhof.
Absolutely. And we have had stuff like that happen over the course of our history. The Bruderhof has moved around a lot in the course of its 100 years. Germany, Liechtenstein, Netherlands, England, Paraguay, Uruguay, United States, Australia, England again, South Korea now. And so, although we kind of have a pretty strong kind of German cultural DNA, and I do on my mother's side of the family, there's actually people from quite a few different nationalities who have joined. And, our direct neighbors for a long time is the South Korean family who's, fully part of our community, and who try to pass on their own culture traditions to their kids. There's people who grew up in Paraguay, Paraguayans, Guarani folks, I'm not making a, Bruderhof is Benton ad claim here, just that it's actually not culturally defined. It's a church that depends on an individual calling to live, in the spirit of the early church.
So there's also, Eberhard Arnold, the founder of the Bruderhof, also had a kind of like vision beyond the very tightly knit, highly committed, vowed community, as to how the Bruderhof how those borders could be a little bit more porous, or how those borders could be stretched.
Yeah, he always saw the community itself as a kind of nucleus with concentric circles of folks who are moved, in his language, right, moved by the same spirit, who are working in their different places and their different vocations for that same renewing of the world, in the spirit of the gospel. And that's really one big reason why the community supports Plough, right? And we try to be one part of that.
I keep sort of having half thoughts that I've not fully formulated about starting something like a Bruderhof tertiary order, which I think would be fun. But yeah, I think that also informs the way that we, as Plough, look at the people who we collaborate with or publish or consider friends. We do not agree. Like we don't have. We're not super good at the friend-enemy distinction. We're just not great at it, in the sense that we disagree with people profoundly on certain issues, but we tend to work on the places that we do agree with people on, and we don't try to enforce a kind of uniformity of thought on the people who we publish, on the people who we do partner with. We find the good. We find the good that they are doing. We find the place that we think they're responding to the Spirit, and we work with that.
And I really do think there is a sense in which encouraging people who are Catholic to be very good Catholics, and people who are Anglican to be very good Anglicans, and people who live in the Bruderhof to be very good, Bruderhof members, and people who are Jewish to, take their Judaism seriously, is not just a kind of, isn't all beautiful that we're different thing, but is a real key to people doing what they're actually meant to be doing in life. And I have, as my authority here, a certain Cardinal Ratzinger who in a meeting with members of our community like 25 years ago said, the solution to the differences between, Catholics in the Bruderhof or Anabaptist communities is not in some type of diplomatic solution where we both sign on the dotted line between carefully negotiated doctrinal statements that we can both affirm, but that for both of us to really seek to follow Jesus as intensively as we can in the traditions that we find ourselves in and are committed to, because if we're following the same Jesus, then that is what will bring unity, and not the other. And I think that is what we try to encourage through Plough, not a sort of superficial sameness.
So one of the big differences that is not minimized at all in America these days is what you might call the culture war. And we got an email from a listener, actually reader, saying, I found your Beyond Borders issue to be very socialist. I'm tired of hearing the same progressive pieties from everywhere, including religious organizations. It seems to detract from the gospel. So are we SJWs? Aren't we just swimming with the progressive stream? Like, are we that annoying?
Right. Well, that's absolutely why we did the Beyond Borders issue, was just to prove to all our progressive friends that we're actually okay.
Yeah.
And the next thing that we're probably going to do is going to do an issue where we sign up for every other progressive.
Yeah. Cause.
And because O'Sullivan's Law is true, the famous one that any organization that doesn't specifically identify itself as right-wing is going to eventually be left-wing, and that surely applies to Plough too, right, Susannah?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've found that.
So actually, everything we just said is not true. I think that any really thorough Christianity is going to tick off everyone eventually.
Yeah.
So welcoming refugees, for instance, and I assume that is what is being referred to by this reader, and I'm glad for the sort of candid response there, is just kind of part of loving your neighbor, but that command to love your neighbor is part of the same gospel that tells us some other things, for instance, about no divorce and remarriage and the sanctity of life, and some other issues that aren't nearly as popular on the left side of the spectrum right now.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the ways to think about this is that if we make you angry, at least we're also going to make your enemies angry, which is sort of comforting.
Do you think that would comfort this particular reader?
I think so.
So Plough has a pretty firm commitment to a range of things, and I don't know why it is that everyone allows that right-wing, left-wing sorting to be applied to them when Christianity and the gospel predates all of this stuff, and it's just silly. Is Dorothy Day, a left-wing or a right-wing person?
Is Oscar Romero,
who we mentioned, is he left-wing or right-wing? I mean, that Opus Dei background, he must be a terrible reactionary, except I believe at the time he was actually, undermined significantly at the Vatican by people who accused him of being a communist, even after his death.
Fannie Lou Hamer, is she a reactionary or is she progressive?
So we could go down the list. I think this kind of returns us in a weird way to our discussion about Christendom at the beginning, right? Because if you are thinking about a particular cultural and political arrangement as the Christian thing that needs defending, the road from there to defending things that are really unchristian, just so that that structure doesn't get disturbed, becomes quite short. Mm-hmm. And if the idea is that we can't let in Haitians and Afghans, who, at least in the Haitians' case, may be far more committed Christians than we are, and possibly with the Afghans too, far more committed Muslims than we are, in the name of protecting sort of the integrity of our country. Well, leave that aside. We're told to love our neighbor as ourselves. Christ in Matthew 25 tells us what it means to clothe the naked, feed the hungry, give the glass of water, visit the prisoner. So we have pretty clear marching orders, and maybe we should just kind of stick to those and not worry about whether that makes us look socialist or not.
I mean, if the corporal works of mercy make us seem like SJWs, I mean, at least some of them will make us seem like SJWs, and then some of them won't.
We can also say that Plough is an adamantly pro-life magazine. We do have an editorial position on that. Those are all things that are part of the same gospel that tells us to take care of the refugee, the stranger, the prisoner, and to care about people with disabilities, to care about the fact that increasingly across the world, all babies with Down syndrome are aborted before they can be born. Mm-hmm. And so that consistent Christian love for the powerless, mm-hmm. for those who are marginalized, those for whom God especially cares, needs to guide us. And I think if we practice thinking along those lines more, I mean, I find myself affected by these same, progressive versus liberal, thought patterns too. But maybe we just need to train our brains not to go down, not to think in those terms, mm-hmm. To do so less and less.
And to, in doing that, be less worried about our own position, and therefore more able to look at the people who might disagree with us, both from the left and from the right, as human beings who God loves and who are similar to us and who are different from us, and who it is not our job to fix, but it is our job to sort of be honest with.
Our founding editor, Edward Arnold, had a great quote that I often think of in this regard, especially right now when people are so apt to disassociate themselves with somebody else just based on the fact that they're on the wrong side of this polarization, right? And he was, again, in the 30s. He came from a religious socialist background himself, but after 1933, when Hitler came to power, he felt pretty strongly that we cannot treat Nazis as demons. They're the same human beings that we were dealing with last year, but now they call themselves Nazis. So we must hate their hateful ideology, but we must treat them as people. Nobody is a devil. And we must extend the same love to them that we wished to extend to them last year before they had signed up for this stuff. And he had this one line that I'll just close my comments on this with, and he said, we are in all ways untimely.
All right. So we have come through another series of 6 episodes of the PloughCast. And as always, we are going to kind of do a little recap. What have we learned from doing this podcast, from doing this issue of the magazine? Let's review.
Right. So, I mean, as always, it's so comforting just to be confirmed in my own opinions that I had at the beginning and not to have changed any of them.
Yeah.
But that's not quite true, actually. One way we could structure this, Susannah, is by going back to the 3 theses that we kind of sketched out at the beginning of this series. And I'll just refresh any listeners' comments, because, of course, you've listened to that first episode.
Haven't you?
And the first thesis was that roots and nationhood are good.
I think you said even nationalism.
And nationalism is good, if you define it the right way. And the second is that welcoming refugees is very good and is actually required. We talked about that today. And the third is that Christendom is good, but we have asterisks, and we talked about some of those today. So of all of those, I think it's actually the first one that I've been thinking the most about.
Me too.
The nationhood and the rootedness piece. Because it seems to me that although there's all kinds of bad nationalisms around, it remains that a real sense of nationhood, of belonging to a people and its story, is really important. And I think in talking about some of this stuff, there's a lot more work to do in terms of explaining what the good form of nationalism looks like.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I feel like, you know, when you kind of get into something, you start realizing how much you don't know and what your gaps are. And I feel like one of my major gaps here is like the actual political philosophy of nation states, and getting into the ideas, like what were the problems that was trying to solve? What is the strongest case that can be made for them? And, you know, one thing that I've been thinking about recently is the fact that the UN Declaration of Human Rights includes the right to national self-determination, meaning like essentially the right to a nation, a people having a state with borders that it can control, is one of the sort of standard understandings, like standard human rights, that this quite like on the normie end of progressive, but quite progressive document in circa 1948 was saying was absolutely crucial to uphold.
And virtually self-evident to uphold.
Virtually self-evident. And like obviously the context was hugely different. Like what they were talking about was something like, you know, anticolonialism. So
sure, because in 1948 there were many, many, you know, clearly identifiable nations that did not have the ability to exercise that right of self-determination.
Right. So under the USSR, which was, you know, essentially an evil empire, as we might say, it was at least a
well, and the British and the French empires were very much intact. The United States was directly controlling, you know, many areas, and had certainly not let go of its sort of imperial ambitions in the Caribbean and in the Philippines and so forth either.
And so it was like one of the things that it was trying to do with this statement was to sort of ease the British Empire in particular, I think, out of the empire business and usher in nation states like India, which was founded in, I want to say 1948 was partition, 1947 was partition, onto the world state.
Israel.
Stage. And Israel.
1948.
Yeah.
And Israel being sort of, as we've talked about, and as Yoram Hazony, you know, outlines in his book on nationalism, where he makes a strong argument for it, Israel being sort of the exemplar of the nation and the nation state. Yeah.
So I do feel like, you know, I am a strong imperialist by my own very strange definition, meaning I think that empire is in various ways a superior political form to the nation state, or at least can be. And also that I think that America kind of is an empire and we should admit it, because trying to make us into a nation state gets really gross. But I do think that like I'm interested in kind of my own personal, you know, following nerdy rabbit trails that I live my life doing. I feel like I want to get more into making the best case I can for the nation state to myself.
Right. So I don't personally feel like I have a political philosophy of nation states. I don't even particularly feel like I need to have one. But it did make me think, I guess, just quite practically, how do I raise my kids? That is why Michael Brendan Doherty's book, My Father Left Me Ireland, left a big impression on me. Because in that book, he writes again about how this absent Irish father wasn't really a father to him, but it did provide a bridge to Irish culture, Irish language, a whole identity that would otherwise just have been lost in, the sea of New Jersey suburbia where he was, growing up. And I think, of the ways that was so important to me that my parents brought me up with a sense that of connection, going back generations, not in some sort of obnoxious way. It's not like, if you go back up, the Momsen family tree, there's, famous, rich and aristocratic people. I mean, there's a couple here and there, but they're really not very notable. But rather just a sense of connection, of obligation, also a sense that there were things that your ancestors, the ones who went to Africa and Sierra Leone after being in one of the early Oberlin classes to, be missionaries there, or the ones who, fought in World War I or whatever, that their lives have a meaning, right? That, that relative who died at age 17 after volunteering to fight for the Kaiser, out of his high school class and is buried somewhere in Paris, you have a connection to him. And, he's part of your story, he's part of your life. And that is something that, if you don't have that, maybe you're a little more susceptible to just being shaped by the zeitgeist in a lot of negative ways, and not really knowing who you yourself are, and not being really kind of in touch with, and this sounds a bit therapeutic, but sort of in touch with, who you yourself really are. And you're more likely to kind of chase cultural will-o'-the-wisps and allow yourself to be formed in a bad way by just whatever happens to be an offer in 2021. Yeah.
And I think one of the things that is so powerful about that is that it really, you don't choose your parents. Like if you want to get interested in who you actually are in terms of the gift of self that you got from your parents and that they got from their parents, and try and trace that story back, you can't shape that story. That story, you can like research it. You can like ask your parents about it. You can like tell the stories again to your children, but this is not a bespoke thing. This is not you trying on different identities to find one that feels right. This is more of a finding out. This is who am I, not by looking inside myself, or to find a true self that's pre-cultural, or the self that is not shaped by your family. And it's also not deciding who I want to be and creating a kind of, Instagram style avatar of the best imaginative self that you can be. It's really something more like, it's more like archaeology. It's more like excavation. It's more like discovery. You're finding out who you are by finding out who your family was.
And then the nation is an extension of that family, right? Because your family's stories, this takes place in a national context. And that's what's, the opposite of a kind of false chauvinism about one's family or one's nation is an honest connection with one's family story, and a love for the people that came before you can very much go with the sort of humbling, discovery of their false moves. So not only, not only have my grandmother herself, who, fled Nazi Germany and, was a refugee and got away. I also have her brother, who joined the Nazi Party because he was scared that the private school the family had run for generations would be shut down unless he did, and just did the coward's move. But then when the Soviets invaded afterwards, and they made him the same offer, said, no, I've burnt myself once and I'm not joining the Communist Party. I've sold my soul once too many already. And learning a story like that and knowing, you know what, this is kind of flesh of my flesh did this. That tells you something a little important about, what it means to take responsibility for the decisions that might lie before, me or my kids. And I think we can do that in a national way too, with all the kind of hemming and hawing we've done about, what our nation is really. The fact is that there is some sort of peoplehood and story that we are part of by being part of a nation. And it's helpful and good to identify it, just so that it's a little easier not to point the finger at previous generations and say, what horrible people, how could they do that? But realize, you know what? Human beings can do really, really, really bad things. And just because we belong to the same story as the people and are, in some cases, biologically descended to them, we need to learn a lot about those things and take responsibility for them and, atone for them. And our lives need to be, in some sense, a response to the harms that the people I belong to have done.
But not just that. I mean, there can be a kind of narcissism of worst people in the worldness. And I think that one of the things that America has a tendency to do is put itself at the center of all stories. And sometimes that can be at the center of the story of being bad guys. And I think that a sort of fuller and more realistic understanding of the story of America is another kind of thing that we can do for ourselves, which is not just to say that we need to invert the pure jingoism into a pure, we are of all people the most wretched and hideous. It means that history is really complicated.
Right. And of course, apart from Native Americans, very few of us or none of us are just American, right? We all came from other places. So there's those stories too. There's those nations too that we belong to. And I think in that sense, although I'm not really sure about the language of empire at all, I do think, that overlapping quality, recognizing that I'm not just American. I also, come from an Irish or, Korean or, Vietnamese family, and I have that nation in me too. Kind of helps guard against that American egomania that either we're, MAGA or we're, the ultimate source of evil in the world, which is both, bogus, right? Yeah. And knowing a bit of other countries' history, will remind us of that pretty fast, and approach it with a bit more of a sense of humor. The other thing I've realized I didn't know very much about, and I still don't, so I'll just sort of register this as a question, is in our conversation with John Milbank in an earlier episode, we talked about the question of does a nation have a soul, and do nations have calling in history? Now, if you go back to the 19th century Romantics, the answer is absolutely yes. A Fichte will, absolutely be very comfortable talking about the calling of England and the calling of France and the calling of Germany. And even our favorite anarcho-syndicalist, atheist, Gustav Landauer, in his wonderful writings, talks about the calling of these different nations in a way that most, let alone progressives, most moderns just would find weird and a bit creepy, right? But I do wonder, is there something there?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that when I started reading the Old Testament after I converted was most surprising to me was that God seemed to notice nations. Nations show up in the Old Testament not as purely ad hoc, nominalist collections of individuals or even collections of families, but as things in themselves, which are responsible before God for their own actions and which God sees as a whole. I have 1,000 questions about this, and there are 1,000 sort of theological niceties that one would want to add on to that, not least, like I kind of jokingly asked John Milbank, but it's not really a joke. Like, if we're going to take these ideas seriously, like, is the nation, when we're talking about the UK, is it the UK? Is it England? Is it an idealized version of England? Is it like that? And there are obviously incredibly dangerous ways that can go. And in fact, with the German Romantic understandings of nationhood did go. But at the same time, if we want to take the scripture seriously, not only does God see nations, but there even are indications that nations or political bodies at least have angels that are attached to them specifically. The book of Daniel talks about this. I have no idea how this works, but it's another challenge to the kind of essentially nominalist, essentially materialist, and individualist idea of how reality works, which I'm always up for.
I think of a comment made by one of our guests, Dan and Jay Jagannathan, who's contributed to our issue, and he said he was talking about America, and of course his own experience of growing up first in India and then Jamaica and then becoming an American citizen, choosing America. And what America is that you're choosing? What does it mean to be patriotic? Which he says, I feel very patriotic, and a lot of people are surprised by that. But he said it's a question of values, and this is the language he used, and he referred to Frederick Douglass and his very eloquent call to America to be America, to be this land of freedom and of justice, and of equality, and a very actually a biblically based vision of what America should be. Maybe that is part of the answer to the question of what is America's calling. America's calling is to be the country that Frederick Douglass
wants it to be,
spoke of.
Yeah. And that it does not necessarily mean, so one of the things that has happened in the last 20 years is that we tried to make a whole lot of other countries look like us. And that didn't work very well. And that is not to say that justice is not part of every country's calling, because it is. And that is not to say that freedom, properly defined, is not part of every country's calling, because it is. But there is an American flavor of what those things mean, and maybe even an American flavor of what it means to be cosmopolitan or international as a nation. The whole nation of immigrants idea that is maybe more specific to America. And I wonder whether, thinking about what Douglass was specifically responding to, the question of slavery, whether there's a particular way in which America's calling is to wrestle with and seek to atone for and seek to move forward from and seek to not reject each other on the basis of questions of racism and questions of, just things that are specific to our own history that are not true of the histories of all other nations.
You mentioned earlier in this series, Susannah, and we've talked about, that great passage in Revelations where each of the nations and the kings of the earth all come into the heavenly Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And so perhaps there we land up again. Mm-hmm. Those nations need to be themselves. Mm-hmm. They need to be the nations that they were created to be in order to come into all together to the heavenly Jerusalem and bring their various gifts, not all the same, to build the kingdom, and that their peoples, I think, in that sense, can be proudly part of those nations as they all, come streaming in, mm-hmm. and that should encourage us, mm-hmm. To have that same kind of not to think that everything about our country is, makes it God's gift to humanity, but realize that it's not just happenstance.
And maybe there is a way in which we need to, listening to Frederick Douglass, listening to a lot of other voices, including the Founding Fathers, I say, as opposed to liberal. I will give the Founding Fathers their due, sort of. Maybe we need to listen to those people and find out who we are as a nation and be ourselves as thoroughly as possible and as justly and mercifully as possible, and then present ourselves before God as that thing. Well, thank you for listening to this last episode of this series of the PloughCast. We'll be back in 6 weeks with more new content. And actually next week's, for the next 6 weeks, there are going to be read aloud pieces from our issue that you can listen to. As always, get in touch with us however you'd like to. You can drop a comment on YouTube, on Twitter. You could email me, sblack.pq@gmail.com.
We'll see you back in 6 weeks.